Thanks for joining us today, Ismail.
Happy to be here. Happy day. Happy New Year and decade.
Happy new decade. Yes, indeed. Especially by the time this comes out, we will be well into 2020
Oh yeah,
and I think there will be even more because it seems like there's more coming out about ayahuasca. It's coming more and more in the mainstream by the day. So by the time this comes out, there will be probably many eyeballs on this and ears wondering, okay, if you could tell us the latest about is this legal here? Where can we get this legally? What's the history? So I'm very excited that you're coming on to talk all about this. So if
totally,
if we could start a little bit by having you tell us some of the history of ayahuasca and the origins.
totally. So there are different ways to interpret history and origins. First off, because I think that one of the questions when it comes to something like ayahuasca or any of its kind of related compounds and combinations that occur all over the Amazon, um, there are the ways that science and that the research community has framed its origins and the way you can think of it from a chemical perspective. And then of course there's also the folklore, the stories that are being told by indigenous people as to its origins. But generally speaking, the consensus is that people within the Amazon started drinking ayahuasca at least two, three, maybe more 1,000 years ago. Um, Often as part of any number of religious or spiritual or community enhancing or personally enhancing or ancestral, cosmological, magical practices. And over the course of kind of one of the first iterations of what we know as the psychedelic 50s, 60s, 70s, ayahuasca and other substances kind of emerged, quote unquote, out of these jungle, these desert spaces into what we know as American and European Western popular consciousness. And although ayahuasca kind of has been part of that for the last some decades, it's been really interesting to notice how, especially in the last 5 years, 10 years, the what people call the globalization of ayahuasca has really expanded at a level that I think was certainly unprecedented, especially for a substance that, for the most part, traveled with the ceremony. And I think that that's one of the interesting things that we can come back to around what makes ayahuasca and yahe and like this particular brew um, so different in some ways from other practices. But yeah, so since then, ayahuasca has spread in different directions. I mean, there are churches that utilize ayahuasca in their sacramental in their ceremonies in a sacramental manner. Some of which that started in Brazil and have expanded to the U.S. and Europe and other parts of the world. And of course, there are a number of kind of syncretic or neo-shamanic or um, otherwise novel kind of iterations of utilization of ayahuasca in various spiritual wellness healing based contexts, and that's kind of where we find ourselves in now, 2020, where ayahuasca has been discussed by popular wellness blogs and politicians and artists, and it kind of has emerged from this, in a very timely way in the midst of this also scientific psychedelic renaissance, and this also resurgence in kind of reassociation with indigenous and earth-based practices in general. So we're in an interesting time, and I think that we're looking at a case study and an expansion of something that is more than just a plant or more than just a drug or more than just a medicine or more than just any one thing, and really a combination of so many different cultural and political and social and historical realities over time that kind of emerge in the ceremony and in the brew.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when you mentioned that, okay, we have this psychedelic renaissance, can you talk a little bit about, you harken back to the 50s and 60s when we had essentially one of the first emergence of widespread psychedelic use. And at that point, I'm guessing that ayahuasca was unregulated in the United States. And is that the case?
Yeah, yes.
And can you talk a little bit about how it went from unregulated, like a lot of the substance we talk about, to where it is today, where part of the substance is regulated, but the plant is not? It's a little bit of a more confusing situation. So if you could talk a little bit about how that
Totally.
happened.
Yeah, it's unfortunately impossible to talk about the prohibition and criminalization of psychedelic substances and plant medicines like ayahuasca without thinking of kind of the larger picture of the war on drugs in general. And essentially, starting in the late 1800s, these narratives emerged where a certain drug or a certain experience was associated with a certain population. The Chinese in the late 1800s, Mexicans during the first reefer madness in the 30s, and then blacks and heroin in the 50s. You know, like over time, we've had this emergence of these different populations, racialized populations, and people that have been socially controlled by criminal law over time that kind of congealed into this into the what we know as the beginning of the war on drugs, the creation of the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And there were a lot of kind of threads that led to that point, and lots that has changed since then. But ultimately, we currently operate in a paradigm where these, you know, certain substances and molecules are controlled under this criminal system, and anything that contains these substances is similarly controlled. So in the case of ayahuasca, when DMT, one of its active ingredients, was included with LSD and psilocybin and mescaline and all the other psychedelic drugs that everyone was afraid of in the late 60s that led to them being criminalized, ayahuasca, which at the time wasn't really like much, you know, wasn't really part of like the public policy conversation, would have been and was swept in with that. So interestingly, the Single Convention in 1971, which created like the modern international drug control scheme, does not control ayahuasca. And that's kind of to what you were implying in your question, where what's interesting is that whereas the United States controls substances and all of the versions and anything that's associated with the substance, including analogs later down the line, ayahuasca and plant brews, ayahuasca and peyote and sacred plants that contain those substances were not actually controlled at the international level. And what that means is that, like, as far as default international law goes, countries, it is up to the countries themselves, the member states, to make decisions about how they control those. Psilocybin is controlled at the international level, and a lot of countries have opted to control things like DMT and ayahuasca, et cetera. And in the U.S., that's what's happened. So we're in the like kind of the default legality of ayahuasca in the United States is that it's illegal. It falls under the Controlled Substances Act, and that use of it violates those laws. And we'll talk a little bit today about some of those exemptions, but that's kind of like the baseline. And it's really because of its association with the other psychedelics and more generally, with other drugs and with kind of this umbrella of social control that we look at that kind of makes up the web of the war on drugs and criminal justice in general.
Yeah, I understand. And if we could talk a little bit, you mentioned that there are exemptions here in the US. Can we talk a little bit about the groups that have exemptions and under what types of laws those exemptions were obtained?
Yeah, there are a couple ways to look at this, but I'll start with kind of the fundamentals, and then go in a little bit into some of the more nuanced aspects of it. So first off, one important thing maybe for your listeners to know is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed in 1993 by Congress after the Supreme Court found that a person's use of peyote could be restricted by a government entity, in this case, a state employer. So that kind of started the conversation, and that was focused on peyote and really created the framework under which the Native American Church operates, which allows its users to utilize peyote as a sacrament in the context of those ceremonies. But that kind of conversation eventually led to that conversation, and then a bust that happened essentially where the DEA contacted a church that was utilizing ayahuasca in the United States as a sacrament. It actually, if I'm not mistaken, seized the sacrament as it was entering the country. And then this church sued DEA for the medicine under its religious freedom protection. And that led to a Supreme Court case in 2006, which affirmed that the Unidad de Vegetal, this Brazilian syncretic church, could utilize ayahuasca as a sacrament, kind of as an extension of the rights that were codified in RFRA and also the First Amendment. So 3 years later, another church went through a similar process in the Ninth Circuit in Oregon and that's Santo Daime, which has followed a very similar kind of similar but different legal strategy, ultimately resulting in a paradigm where the UDV and the Santo Daime are two churches that have permission from DEA to operate as churches that kind of utilize the sacrament as part of their religious ceremony. So that's kind of that's like the stuff that's definitely clearly enshrouded in law. What gets a little bit more nuanced is the fact that at the same time, there are a lot of communities that are utilizing ayahuasca under these protections, but that are not necessarily part of those groups. And that can be anywhere from the legal, and I'm talking specifically again within the United States here. So there are people who are attempting to do retreats or creating churches or communities here that follow the law as specified in RFRA and and then in that Supreme Court case that operate as if they have permission. And there are people who believe that that those protections do extend to communities that are operating in those ways, whether or not they have the formal kind of title of those churches that were actually exempted. Others take a more conservative approach and believe that the only entities that are legally able to, or that would not be kind of bothered by DEA or by law enforcement to actually engage, would be these named churches. And I think that's really kind of where the question is currently left at. There is a process for churches to apply for an exemption to the Controlled Substances Act for this use. But it's been a complicated process and convoluted. And so far, no one has been able to go through that process all the way and actually get the exemption affirmatively from DEA. So it's kind of there's kind of a gray area in which, for now, multiple actors are operating in, and it'll be interesting to see the extent to which any sort of law enforcement, whether it's local or DEA or someone else, start to pay attention to it. Hopefully they don't. It would probably make sense for them to stay out of it, because religious use of a substance is maybe something that should not be within criminal law. That's something that's deeper. It's about our constitutional, personal values. And at the same time, because there's really no effective structure to determine who does and does not get an exemption, who does not get permission, there are a lot of big questions that still that still need to be answered.
Yeah, I was going to ask how that process worked, because I've seen that there are a number of churches, like I believe the one From Shock to Awe was one, that are in the process, but like how long have they been in the process, and what are the milestones? Like I was wondering how convoluted or versus how simple a process this was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I obviously wouldn't speak for the communities themselves, for the churches themselves, because different groups are at different stages and have different strategies and different opinions about how to go about it. But in general, so I believe after the case in 2009, the Ninth Circuit case, DEA came out with an administrative procedure which a community or a church could apply for an exemption for permission to utilize a sacrament. What's complex about that is that if you look at what actually happened after the UDV and Santo Daime got permission, part of what occurred was a sudden increase in administrative oversight and a huge need to do record keeping and prepare. And so these churches are no longer just operating as like their traditional services, but now they have to have records that they can show to DEA and get verified for. So the actual load, what's expected or what may be expected of churches, is still potentially very high. And that's partially because of the question of where does the medicine come from? The DEA is really most interested in diversion. What is this? Where is the substance coming from, and who's getting it? So it's not just do these people deserve to utilize this substance in their religious context or whatever. It's also, do they also have the infrastructure that would protect it from not getting anywhere else besides where they say it's going to go? So that's really one of the big pieces that self-organized church or religious or spiritual communities don't always have the capacity to do. And there isn't necessarily an alternative at this point, but it does seem like because of all of the momentum, we'll see more and more churches either working together or getting more creative about how they engage with that. So so just to be a little bit more specific to your question, the core understanding is that there are 8 factors that are spelled out in the Supreme Court case that determine that the church, or presumably an overseeing entity, would use to look at, well, is this church actually following what we conceive of, we as the Supreme Court, we as American law conceive of as a religious organization that's doing these things. So you kind of have to like sync up, like what, a community is doing to what, like the DEA and what the Supreme Court expects or anticipates, and then hope for the best. And that's something that's a huge gray area. And it's unsurprising that few communities have really tried to go forward, because it puts them in a lot of risk. And I commend the bravery of people who are trying to get creative. And I also hope that people who move forward do it really in coalition and dialogue with other churches, other communities, other attorneys, other practitioners. There are a number of indigenous practitioners who come to the United States, and like, the heat for, the church in whatever random state or whatever random place doesn't just hit them, it hits everyone in the community. And I think it's really important to think about the fact that so far, people who utilize ayahuasca have generally, not entirely, but generally speaking, and overwhelmingly really been able to operate without getting interacted by law enforcement. And that's a good thing because of a lot of reasons. And the easiest way to put it is that, like, if the community can show that it's responsible, that it's self-organized, that it has materials, that it's providing good information, that it's not getting like too excited about online advertising or whatever, like, I don't care. That maybe like these large law enforcement agencies don't have to engage, because maybe there's another way to handle this. So thinking about it from that context can be really helpful, because it's really easy, and I don't blame anyone, but it's really easy for people when they find the medicine, when they find ayahuasca, or they find community or ceremony through some way. If they go to South America, they find it through a community, they have it underground wherever they live, or they go to a church. Like, it's sometimes like really, it is important. It is important to focus on our individual healing, and to really focus on how this mindfulness, these practices can bring us to ourselves, bring us in alignment. That's totally true. And that's totally not the whole picture. And like, we are like doing this enters us and enters people into a community that is amorphous and like isn't really clearly defined, and like is going to take a long time before it figures out what it actually means. But our behavior really does impact other people. And I think it's really important to remember that in a paradigm where like the alternative to, being cautious and expanding carefully and giving people accurate information is, like I said earlier, the war on drugs. And we just don't, there's a way to find a way to like disarm and like just kind of drop the general threshold of where this conversation is at to a level that's much more human, while also not leaving those other people behind, So there's a lot to say there, but there are a lot of interesting directions we could still go.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, this is fascinating. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act was one of my favorite things to discuss in law school, and I never foresaw that like nearly a decade later we'd be having this conversation.
I forgot that. Yeah. Oh my God, that's so funny. And yeah, I totally hear you.
Yeah, because we went
That
over
is
these cases, and I was like, well, this is fascinating, but I thought, I'll, noted, but I'll never discuss this again in my life. And then here we are, because you never know.
totally.
Love it. Okay.
And by the way, with this conversation, it's only going to get more important, by the way, because like all of that, what I just said, like the pressure is kind of on, like it's only going to get more active. And like you said at the beginning of this conversation, like there are only going to be more people that think even more creative ways, and someone's got to figure out a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, with these new people who are looking at ayahuasca as they're hearing about it, they're thinking, okay, is this something I could potentially do? And they're not necessarily part of one of these religions in the US. If we could talk a little bit about how you said, okay, it's not in the international paradigm. So where are there countries that are allowing this practice? And if you want to throw in, how each country differs a little bit, that would also be great.
Totally. Yeah. So I can speak about that very generally, just to give kind of some overview, but things change, and especially because of because globalization is rapidly impacting policy in a lot of places, things change quickly. So all that to say that there are, I don't know what the whole list is, but theoretically, any country that does not affirmatively regulate ayahuasca theoretically, ayahuasca is unregulated in any country that has not affirmatively chosen to do so, like within that country itself. At the same time, a number of countries, like generally speaking, it's fair to assume that law enforcement, when given the choice, defaults to enforcement rather than non-enforcement. So if you look at global drug policy in general, it's usually the case that more resources have been spent to do more versus the other way around. So really, when we're talking about where people are utilizing ayahuasca, it's mostly in places that have either actively commented on it and chosen to regulate it in some way, like Peru, Colombia, Brazil, and I'll come back to those. Or places where it's more unregulated but permitted because there are other laws that are similar that protect people who work with other substances, like Mexico. That might be the case in South Africa. And there are places where, because of the lack of international control, there isn't really a visible conversation about what it means to be importing ayahuasca into those places, because people are just bringing it themselves. So there, because there isn't like an industry around. Well, there isn't a visible industry, I should say, around buying and selling ayahuasca where that's like freely traded. It's all happening more or less at the individual or community level. That just means that, like, most of the conversation about ayahuasca legality in other places has occurred within the countries themselves, and different countries have different. So to get to your question, so maybe one of the easiest examples to start with is Peru, and which has created some basic regulatory and oversight frameworks over the kind of like ayahuasca tourism that they just kind of emerged in Iquitos and other parts of the country. However, a lot of those kind of general live and let live, semi like loosely regulated and generally permitted kind of activities have started to shift, partially because of a lot of attention drawn to specific instances of violence. I'm sure you might have heard of Olivia Arevalo and people like that, who Shipibo practitioners and others who are indigenous knowledge stewards, as well as land defenders, as well as water defenders, people who are really who a number of indigenous leaders and others who have been both involved in medicine work and also frontline work against exploitative international companies have been murdered over the last many years. And although the case with Olivia in Iquitos or in Peru is not exactly that same situation as far as it seems, situations like that have brought a lot of attention to the kind of the quote unquote industry that's been emerging there. And there have been concerns, and this is one thing that would be good to get more specific information about, which is the extent to which the Peruvian government is responding to, or what their kind of plan is with respect to how to manage what they're concerned about, and like what they see as crime and harm kind of coming out of this new industry, even though the cases that have emerged are pretty extreme and extremely rare, and not indicative of the majority of what's been happening. That kind of attention has really impacted it. So that's one example, and that's more around like the ayahuasca tourism kind of framework. Although of course there's also levels of protection for indigenous practices in Peru. And my understanding is that there are some things that the Peruvian government has done to affirmatively support in the past and now preservation of culture. Although it's always controversial because the relationship between governments and indigenous peoples is complicated and in flux and often adversarial almost everywhere, unfortunately. So in Brazil's actually a good example of that, where religious use of ayahuasca by the structured religions that I mentioned earlier is permitted and in fact protected and really supported by the Brazilian government. But the indigenous use does not have the same kind of protection. And in this kind of tragic twist, where in Brazil in particular, you have indigenous people who are trying to defend the Amazon, many of whom utilize the medicine, who are being literally murdered, who are being genocided, who are being taken out of their homes, forced to migrate, fighting against multinational operations that are working often in conjunction with the Brazilian government, only to have people from high up in the UDV and other high up in the UDV involved in like Bolsonaro's regime. So it's a really complicated situation in Brazil, where ayahuasca is part of the discourse, but it's as utilized and some might say co-opted by kind of the far right structure of that religious institution there. So that's a little bit political and a little bit edgier, but that's the reality of it. And it's unfortunately not as simple as it is here and maybe in Europe, where it's like people who utilize ayahuasca generally tend to be on the left and tend to care about the environment, when in reality, there are people who are working with it in the religious context in Brazil who are part of the destruction of the Amazon right now. So that's one. And then in places like Colombia and Bolivia, and I'm sure other countries in South America, there you also see like levels of indigenous use and levels of practice that are either permitted actively or otherwise kind of more generally regulated. The other example to maybe talk about is places where drugs are decriminalized, but ayahuasca is being used. So places like the Czech Republic or Spain or Portugal. And in those places, all drugs have been decriminalized, or personal use or possession of drugs is being decriminalized. And that is a slightly different situation, because in that case, there's no drug control at the level of personal use and possession. And although technically the ceremony would not may or may not fall in that category, because it's like a group and there's like facilitation and stuff, have been a lot of like court cases and policy conversations in places like Spain about how something like ayahuasca like can or should be integrated into the system. So, it's not. I'm sure there are people who would answer your question with like, yeah, these are the places where it's safe to go do ayahuasca, and all those things are true. But the reality is that like the legal landscape is super complex, and although like it is possible to do ceremonies in Peru, in Costa Rica, in Mexico, in South Africa, I think in Canada, like there's places where you can find things and find people doing it. The extent to which it's safe there's kind of a spectrum between like tolerated or let's say criminalized versus tolerated versus allowed versus supported versus integrated. So there's kind of like a whole spectrum with respect to how it's integrated into society and culture in general.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That I know a lot of people who listen to this, they may be thinking, okay, I'm going to go do ayahuasca for the first time, and their only thought is like, will I be arrested for doing this thing? And so that's a good point, that it's definitely a continuum of like, maybe you won't be arrested, but it's not supported
Totally.
in the same way.
Totally. Generally speaking, if you go to South America, you're like, I mean, do your research, but places like it's permitted in places like that, where the origin is. But there's also we don't have to go into it now, but there's also a secondary conversation about what it means for tons of foreigners to be flocking into the Amazon. But maybe that's for another day.
We will have an entire separate episode on that for sure.
Great.
Chakruna will see to it that I have an entire episode on this.
Great.
This will, yes, do not worry.
I'm sure.
This will definitely happen. But I appreciate that kind of, I know you said it's hard to speak for each country, but to give people kind of a general overview of like,
Totally.
okay, where can we start looking? Thank you for that guidance. I wanted to ask one question, and I know, like you said, the legal landscape is ever changing, but as of last year, there was the Decriminalize Nature Oakland movement that decriminalized all entheogenic plants, one of which is ayahuasca. Can you talk a little bit about what effect that's had on people's ability to undertake the ceremony there?
Totally. So this is an interesting situation, because first it'll be helpful to break down exactly what we mean by decriminalization, because the media described it as decriminalization, and there is a way where, based on what people call de facto decriminalization, where like in actuality, like people who are working with these substances or working with these ceremonies or growing these plants are not being criminalized. But I just want to note that what actually happened in Oakland was that the resolution that was passed by City Council, and this is also actually what happened in Denver with psilocybin, deprioritized enforcement. So what that means is that deprioritization basically just means that the local law enforcement specifically would not put resources toward enforcing laws around these particular substances. So the thing about what's happening in Oakland and pretty much everywhere else in the U.S. is that law enforcement was already not spending that many resources to look at people who are doing the medicine, right? That's not really something you hear about, and it's really not the case. There have been some cases, but in the United States, but for the most part, the DEA has not put resources towards seeking people who are doing ceremony peacefully, in the context of their communities, whatever. Like that's just not been a major public health priority or concern. So that in that way, it was basically saying that the city of Oakland is aware of the fact that there are people within the city that are interested, that like want to be able to do this free of that fear of criminalization. But the reality is that most criminal laws actually enforced at the state level, which means that the people who you really need to convince to not bug you is the state police. And really, you want to do that with federal law enforcement as well, because psychedelic mushrooms, ayahuasca, all these substances remain criminalized under state and federal law, even if the city says that they're permitted in the resolution. So all that to say that, like, technically speaking, the legal status of the substances did not change. But what changed was the city of Oakland and Oakland law enforcement's perception of the use of the substances in the city. So the next step is that in June of this year, a Decriminator Oakland will meet again with the city and with Oakland law enforcement and have a conversation about what kind of education, what kind of work they've done in the last year to educate the community and to essentially prepare the community for what could eventually be a paradigm in which these substances could be permitted actively and, as I was saying earlier, protected by, to some extent, by the city. And the reason that's relevant is because that could mean, theoretically, that one day the city of Oakland and the Oakland law enforcement could, let's say, negotiate with the state of California and negotiate with the federal government and say, we want to allow people to do these medicines here. We will deal with enforcement. You stay out. This is similar, not exactly the same, but similar in some ways to what happened with cannabis, where like the federal government was like, we're going to stop. If a state legalizes it, we're not going to bother them. I mean, they still did, but they said that they wouldn't, and then eventually they didn't. So this is kind of similar, where like we want like what people in Oakland want is that they aren't bothered by law enforcement when they're doing their thing. So right now, technically nothing has changed from a legal perspective, but it's absolutely true that we're experiencing a pretty significant kind of communications, community, and maybe conversation shift because of the movement and because of decrimination and what it brought forward. So now there's actually a conversation between the advocates and the city of Oakland, and now advocates in numerous other cities and their local governments about what it would look like to do that. And that's really exciting. And it's just like the very, very, very first step of a much larger conversation. Unfortunately, I have to also mention that, like, one of the kind of big picture things to be considering in this when people are thinking about this movement is also the reality that we are in a time that, from a public health perspective and from a justice perspective, it actually would be much more efficient and right to fully decriminalize the use and possession of all drugs. And that is a conversation that is no longer as much on the fringe now that we have about 15 years of data from Portugal, as well as other kind of analysis that has supported that potential value. So I will say that I appreciate what Decriminator is doing, and I think that it's a really critical part of this larger conversation about how we and how our culture relate to plants, to the land, to indigeneity. But also there's a larger conversation that I hope that it doesn't eclipse, because I think that it's really critical that we focus on those big picture justice and those bigger questions around justice and access and incarceration. I think all of that is folded in, and the reality is that this movement benefits from all of those bigger picture movements as well. So I just have to put in a plug for that, because I do think it's important to make sure people see as much of that picture as possible.
I thoroughly appreciate that. And in my dream scenario, someday we have Dr. Carl Hart on to do whatever he did at Horizons and at the Psychedelic
Totally.
Science Summit, and just blow the lid off of that,
Totally.
the war on drugs period. I would love to have that conversation on here, because I think you're right. That's absolutely crucial. Like, we see, I think a lot of us who just want to see people get some access to medicines see a lot of hope in these movements. But then you're right. Like, what's the other side is that, okay, now we have the good drugs and the bad drugs. And
Totally.
yeah.
And I would ask people, like, what is the purpose of our spiritual transformation? Like, ayahuasca is a really powerful tool that has done a lot for a lot of people, and is, to so many people, a friend and an ally, and like part of this larger kind of like fight for the spirit of Mother Earth. People really hold it that way. And I think so much it's helpful to remember, especially for people who first discover the medicine, who are interested in hearing about and experiencing and do experience their healing journey, that like we remember that like part of the reason to do spiritual work and to do this healing work is so we have the resilience to engage with the world as it is and engage with the darkness and the shadow. Like, I like to say to people that psychedelics are like the sparkly rainbow gate into the shadow. Like, we're really talking about trauma, we're really talking about suffering and really deep, intense topics, war and violence and pain. And because that's what we're healing from, right? But like, the healing doesn't have to happen in their own bubble. We're like by ourselves with our own story. It's also like, how has this impacted you, community? How has it impacted you? So that like interactive aspect of bringing people in but not like in a intensely evangelical way either, because there's a whole psychedelic evangelical
Right.
proselytizing thing that also isn't necessarily good. But there is something to be said for really expanding the scope of what it means to heal and why we heal and why we do it and why political, social, cultural engagement is so critical. We're healing so like our children and our children's children and all these generations in the future don't have to suffer, which will only happen if we talk about all the stuff that everyone is healing from. So, yeah,
I am so glad you threw that in. And also, I think it's a beautiful place to wrap up this conversation.
perfect.
Absolutely, like because you're right. Like it's all about we're talking about the history and legality of a substance, but why are we taking this substance, and what are we hoping to collectively get from this? And so I'm thrilled that you added that in. Where can people find out more about your work? And because I know you've published a number of papers talking about different subjects. So where can people find out more?
Totally. So, right now, definitely check out the MAPS website, www.maps.org. That has like kind of so much of the information about the research and kind of the work that we've been doing in general. But as far as kind of some of the conversations around more cultural, kind of political questions, I can name a few talks that might be helpful to also check out. My friend Lauren Ali and I gave a talk at Boom Festival in 2018 called Do the Right Thing. Reciprocity in the psychedelic renaissance, which kind of goes a little bit more into ayahuasca specifically and around like how to be in relation to people of the like indigenous people of the jungle, and like how we as people from the global north like can think about these larger conversations. And then there's an article that my friend Justice and I wrote called Colonization Laid the Groundwork for the War on Drugs, which is on the Fix. And then for kind of a general overarching understanding of MAPS's strategy and our values around a lot of these questions, you can go to maps.org/policy reform. And that has like kind of a really general overview of some of our considerations. And we'll be coming out with more materials, a lot more materials over the course of this year, given the conversations about Decrim Nature and Decrim California and what's going on in Oregon and all of that. So definitely stay tuned. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at sage_Izzy.
Very cool. We'll put that all in the show notes. I appreciate that. Thanks for giving
Sweet.
us, thanks for giving me and all the other law school nerds somewhere cool to go and like relive our religious freedom days. And for everybody else out there
Totally.
who's curious about ayahuasca, I've been fascinated reading just some of the background and the legal history. So I really appreciate you having this conversation with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. All right. For everybody else out there, until next time.